Good afternoon, y'all, and welcome to this latest session of the Walter Rodney reading. We're going to be continuing Chapter 5 today, starting the second section of that chapter, which is called The Strengthening of the Technological and Military Aspects of Capitalism, a preliminary examination of the non-monetary benefits of colonialism to Europe. Now, I feel like I had actually read this a time or two before, but apparently I had some kind of situation going on with my brain, and I ended up having such a bad episode of Deja Vu that I ended up scrapping those episodes. So this is actually like my third attempt to like get this episode recorded for y'all. So I apologize for the long delay, but y'all can expect the recordings to go back to being weekly the way they had been. So um, thank you as always. If you're following along in the Discord, you can find the PDF in the pin section, and if you're following along on YouTube, thank you as well. As always, you can find the PDF in the description of the YouTube video. So, without further ado, let's get along to How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, Chapter 5, Section 2.2, The Strengthening of the Technological and Military Aspects of Capitalism, a preliminary examination of the non-monetary benefits of colonialism in Europe. I think we're just going to read Section 8 today, a preliminary examination of the non-monetary benefits of colonialism in Europe. So, let's get started. There are still some bourgeois propagandists who assert that colonialism was not a paying concern for Europeans, just as there are those who say that the slave trade was not profitable to Europeans. It is not worthwhile to engage in the direct refutation of such a viewpoint, since it consumes time which could otherwise be more usefully employed. The foregoing section was a statement of the level of actual monetary profits made by colonialist powers out of Africa. But Africa's contribution to European capitalism was far better than mere monetary returns. The colonial system permitted the rapid development of technology and skills within the metropolitan sectors of imperialism. It has also allowed for the elaboration of the modern organizational techniques of the capitalist firm and of imperialism as a whole. Indeed, colonialism gave capitalism an added lease of life and prolonged its existence in Western Europe, which had been the cradle of capitalism. At the beginning of the colonial period, science and technology, as applied to production, already had a firm base inside Europe, a situation which was itself connected to overseas trade, as previously explained. Europe then was entering the age of electricity, of advanced ferrous and non-ferrous metallurgy, and the proliferation of manufactured chemicals. All of these were carried to great heights during the colonial period. Electrical devices were raised to the qualitatively new level of electronics, incorporating miniaturization of equipment, fantastic progress in telecommunications, and the creation of computers. Chemical industries were producing a wide range of synthetic substitutes for raw materials, and a whole new branch of petrochemicals had come into existence. The combination of metals by metallurgical innovations meant that products could be offered to meet far-reaching demands of heat resistance, lightness, tensile strength, etc. At the end of colonialism, say 1960, Europe was on the verge of another epoch, that of nuclear power. It is common knowledge that the gap between the output of the metropoles and that of the colonies increased by at least 15 to 20 times during the epoch of colonialism. More than anything else, it was the advance of scientific technique in the metropoles which was the cause of the Great Gulf between Africa and Western European levels of productivity by the end of the colonial period. Therefore, it is essential to understand the role of colonialism itself in bringing about that scientific progress in the metropoles and its application to industry. It would be extremely simple-minded to say that colonialism in Africa or anywhere else caused Europe to develop its science and technology. The tendency towards technological innovation and renovation was inherent in capitalism itself because of the drive for profits. However, it would be entirely accurate to say that the colonization of Africa and other parts of the world formed an indispensable link in a chain of events which made possible the technological transformation of the base of European capitalism. Without that link, European capitalism would not have been producing goods and services at the level attained in 1960. In other words, our very yardsticks for measuring developed and underdeveloped nations would have been different. Profits from American colonialism mingled with profits from every other source to finance scientific research. This was true in the general sense that the affluence of capitalist society in the present century allowed more money and leisure for research. It is also true because the development of capitalism in the imperialist epoch continued the division of labor inside the capitalist metropoles to the point where scientific research was a branch of the division of labor, and indeed one of its most important branches. European society moved away from scientific research as an ad hoc, personal, and even whimsical affair to a situation where research was given priority by governments, armies, and private capitalists. It was funded and guided. Careful scrutiny reveals that the source of funding and the direction in which research was guided were heavily influenced by the colonial situation. Firstly, it should be recalled that profits made by Europe from Africa represented investable surpluses. The profit was not merely an end in itself. Thus, the East and West African currency boards invested in British government stock, while the commercial banks and insurance companies invested in government bonds, mortgages, and industrial shares. These investment funds acquired from the colonies spread to many sectors in the metropoles and benefited industries that had nothing to do with the processing of colonial products. However, it is easier to trace the impact of colonial exploitation on industries directly connected with colonial imports. Such industries had to improvise that kind of machinery which most effectively utilized colonial raw materials. That led, for example, to machinery for crushing palm kernels into a process for utilizing the less delicately favored coffee by turning it into a soluble powder, namely instant coffee. Raw mutuals could be modified to meet specifications of European factories in quality and quantity. An example of this type would be the care taken by the Dutch in Java and by the Americans in Liberia to breed and graft new variety of rubber plants, yielding more and being more resistant to disease. Ultimately, the search for better quality raw materials merged with the search for sources of raw material, which would make European capitalism less dependent on colonial areas, and that led to synthetics. In the sphere of shipping, it can readily be appreciated that certain technological modifications and modal innovations would be connected with the fact that such a high proportion of shipping was used to tie together colonies and metropoles. Ships had to be refrigerated to carry perishable goods. They had to make special holds for bulky or liquid cargoes such as palm oil and the transport of petroleum from the Middle East, North Africa, and other parts of the world to oil tankers as a special class of ships. The design of ships and the nature of their cargoes in turn affected the kind of port installations in the metropoles, where connections were remote or even apparently non-existent. It can still be claimed that colonialism was a factor in the European technological revolution. As science blossomed in the present century, its interconnections became numerous and complex. It is impossible to trace the origin of every study and every invention, but it is well understood by serious historians of science that the growth of the body of scientific knowledge and its application to everyday life is dependent upon a large number of forces operating within the society as a whole, and not just upon the ideas within given branches of science. With the rise of imperialism, one of the most potent forces within metropolitan capitalist societies was precisely that emanating from colonial or semi-colonial areas. The above considerations apply fully to any discussion of the military aspects of imperialism. The protection of empire being one of the crucial stimulants added to the science of armaments in a society that was already militaristically inclined ever since the feudal era. The new colonial dimension to European military preoccupation was particularly noticeable in the sharp naval rivalry between Britain, Germany, France, and Japan before and during the First Cold World War. The rivalry over colonies and for spheres of capitalist investment produced new types of armed naval vessels, such as destroyers and submarines. By the end of the Second World War, military research had become the most highly organized branch of scientific research, and one that was subsidized by the capitalist states from the profits of international exploitation. During the interwar years, Africa's foremost contribution to the evolution of organizational techniques in Europe was the strengthening of monopoly capital. Before the War of 1914, the Pan-Africanists Deuce Muhammad Ali and W.E.B. Du Bois recognized that monopoly capital was the leading element in imperialist expansion. The most thorough and the best known analysis of this phenomenon was made by the Russian revolutionary leader Lenin. Lenin was virtually prophetic because as the colonial age advanced, it became more and more obvious that those who stood to benefit most were the monopoly concerns, and especially those involved in finance. Africa plus Asia and Latin America contributed to the elaboration of the strategies by which competition among small companies gave way to domination by a small handful of firms in various economic activities. It was on the India trade routes that shipping companies first started the conference lines in 1875. This monopoly practice spread rapidly to the South African trade and reached a high pitch in West Africa. On the commercial side, it was in West Africa that both the French and the English derived considerable experience in pooling and market sharing, apart from the fact that little companies were steadily being gobbled up by bigger ones from the beginning to the end of colonialism. It was in Southern Africa that there emerged the most carefully planned structures of interlocking directorates, holding companies and giant corporations, which were multinational both in their capital subscriptions and through the fact that their economic activities were dispersed in many lands. Individual entrepreneurs like Oppenheimer made huge fortunes from the Southern African soil. We've been learning about Oppenheimer and the Oppenheimer Empire and Neo-colonialism. It's kind of crazy how they borrow from each other's research and perspectives. So individual entrepreneurs like Oppenheimer made huge fortunes from the Southern African soil, but Southern Africa was never really in the era of individual and family businesses, characteristic of Europe and America up to the early part of this century. The big mining companies were impersonal professional things. They were rationalized in terms of personnel, production, marketing, advertising, etc., and they could undertake long-term commitments. At all times, interproductive forces gave capitalism its drive towards expansion and domination. It was the system which expanded, but in addition, one can see in Africa, and in Southern Africa in particular, the rise of a capitalist superstructure manned by individuals capable of consciously planning the exploitation of resources right into the next century, and aiming at racist domination of the black people of Africa until the end of time. Ever since the 15th century, Europe was in strategic command of world trade and the legal and organizational aspects of the movement of goods between continents. Europe's power increased with imperialism because imperialism means investments, and investments with or without colonial rule gave European capitalists control over production within each continent. The amount of benefits to capitalism increased accordingly, since Europe could determine the quantity and quality of different raw material inputs which would need to be brought together in the interest of capitalism as a whole, and of the bourgeoisie class in particular. For instance, sugar production in the West Indies was joined in the colonial period by cocoa production within Africa, so that both merged into the chocolate industry of Europe and North America. In the metallurgical field, iron ore from Sweden, Brazil, or Sierra Leone could be turned into different types of steel with the addition of manganese from the Gold Coast or chrome from Southern Rhodesia. Such examples could be multiplied almost indefinitely to cover the whole range of capitalist production in the colonial period. As John Stuart Mill said, the trade between England and the West Indies in the 18th century was like the trade between town and country. In the present century, the links are even closer, and it is more marked that the town, Europe, is living off the countryside, Africa, Asia, and Latin America. When it is said that colonies should exist for the metropoles by producing raw materials and buying manufactured goods, the underlying theory was to introduce an international division of labor covering working people everywhere. That is to say, up to that point, each society had allocated to its own members particular functions in production. Some hunted, some made clothes, some built houses. But with colonialism, the capitalists determined what types of labors the workers should carry on in the world at large. Africans were to dig minerals out of the subsoil, grow agricultural crops, collect natural products, and perform a number of other odds and ends, such as bicycle repairing. Inside of Europe, North America, and Japan, workers would refine the minerals and the raw materials and make the bicycles. The international division of labor, brought about by imperialism and colonialism, ensured that there would be the maximum increase in the level of skills in the capitalist nations. It took mainly physical strength to dig the minerals from and to farm the African soil. but the extraction of the metals from the ores and the subsequent manufacture of finished goods in Europe promoted more and more technology and skills there as time went on. Take the iron and steel industry as an example. Modern steel manufacture derives from the Siemens open hearth system and the Bessemer process, which were both already in existence in the second half of the last century. They both underwent major modifications, transforming steel manufacture from intermittent operations to something requiring huge continuous electrical furnaces. In more recent years, skilled workmen have been replaced by automation and computerization, but altogether the gains in technology and skills were immense as compared with the years before imperialism got underway. Iron ore was one of Africa's major exports in the colonial days, and it may therefore appear to be an irrelevant example. However, iron was very significant in the economy of Sierra Leone, Liberia, and North Africa. It can be used to illustrate the trend by which the International Division of Labor allowed technology and skills to grow in the metropoles. Furthermore, it must be recalled that Africa was an important source of the minerals that went into making steel alloys, notably manganese and chrome. Manganese was essential in the Bessemer process. It was mined in several places in Africa, with the Noda mine on the Gold Coast having the largest single manganese deposit in the world. American companies owned the Gold Coast and North African mines and used the product in the steel industry of the USA. Chrome from South Africa and Southern Rhodesia also played a similar role in steel metallurgy. Metallurgy? I'm going to have to YouTube that later. Being essential for the manufacture of stainless steel. Columbite was another of the African minerals valuable for the creation of steel alloys. Being highly heat resistant, one of its principal uses was in making steel for jet engines. First of all, it was the rapid development of European industry and technology which caused Columbite to assume value. It had been a discarded byproduct of tin mining in Nigeria up to 1952. Then once it was utilized, it gave further stimulus to European technology in the very sophisticated sphere of aero engines. Obviously, according to the International Division of Labor prevailing under colonialism, it was the American, Canadian, British, and French workers who had access to the skills involved in working with columbite, rather than the Nigerian worker who dug the ore out of the ground. For certain reasons, columbite fell off sharply in demand after a few years, but during that time it had contributed towards making the European metallurgists even more proficient and experienced. In that way, it was helping to promote self-sustained growth and to produce the gap which is evident in any comparison of the developed and underdeveloped countries. Copper, too, fell neatly into the category under discussion. Unskilled production by Africans was required to get the ore for export, followed by refinement in a European capitalist plant. Copper was Africa's chief mineral export. Being an excellent conductor of electricity, it became an indispensable part of the capitalist electrical industry. It is an essential component of generators, motors, electrical locomotives, telephones, telegraphs, light and power lines, motor cars, buildings, ammunition, radios, refrigerators, and a host of other things. A technological era tends to be defined by the principal source of power. Today we speak of a nuclear age, since the potential of nuclear power is shown to be immense. The Industrial Revolution in Europe during the 18th and 19th centuries was the age of steam. In a parallel manner, the colonial epoch was the age of electricity. Therefore, the vital copper exports from Congo, North Rhodesia, and other parts of Africa were contributing to the leading sector of European technology. From that strategic position, its multiplier effects were innumerable and were of incalculable benefit to capitalist development. In the context of a discussion of raw materials, special reference must again be made to the military. African minerals played a decisive role both with regard to conventional weapons and with regard to the breakthrough to atomic and nuclear weapons. It was from the Belgian Congo during the Second World War that the USA began getting the uranium, which was a prerequisite to the making of the first atomic bomb. In any case, by the end of the colonial period, industry and the war machine and the colonizing nations had become so intertwined and inseparable that any contribution to one was a contribution to the other. Therefore, Africa's massive contribution to what initially appears as peaceful pursuits, such as the making of copper wire and steel alloys, ultimately took the shape of explosive devices, aircraft carriers, and so on. It was only after European firearms reached a certain stage of effectiveness in the 19th century that it became possible for whites to colonize and dominate the whole world. Similarly, the invention of a massive array of new instruments of destruction in the metropoles was both a psychological and practical disincentive to colonized people seeking to regain power and independence. It will readily be recalled that a basic prop to colonialism in Africa and elsewhere was the gunboat policy, which was resorted to every time that the local police and armed forces seemed incapable of maintaining the metropolitan law and the colonial order of affairs. From the viewpoint of the colonized, the strengthening of the military apparatus of the European powers through colonial exploitation was doubly detrimental. Not only did it increase the overall technological gap between metropole and colony, but it immeasurably widened the gap in the most sensitive area, which had to do with concepts such as power and independence. The international division of labor of the colonial period also ensured that there would be growth of employment opportunities in Europe, apart from the millions of white settlers and expatriates who earned a livelihood in and from Africa. Agricultural raw materials were processed in such a way as to form byproducts constituting industries in their own right. The number of jobs created in Europe and North America by the import of mineral ores from Africa, Asia, and Latin America can be seen from the massive employment role of institutions such as steelworks, motor car factories, alumina and aluminum plants, copper wire firms, etc. Furthermore, those in turn stimulated the building industry, the transport industry, the munitions industry, and so on. The mining that went on in Africa left holes in the ground, and the pattern of agricultural production left African soils impoverished. But in Europe, agricultural and mineral imports built a massive industrial complex. In the earliest phases of human organization, production was scattered and atomized. That is to say, families preserved a separate identity while working for their upkeep. Over time, production became more social and interrelated in character. The making of a pair of shoes in a mature feudal trading economy involved a cattle rearer, a tanner of the leather, and a shoemaker, instead of one peasant killing an animal and making himself a pair of shoes as under self-sufficient communalism. The extent to which a society achieves a social interdependence in making commodities is the index of its development through specialization and coordination. Undoubtedly, European capitalism achieved more and more of social character in its production. It integrated the whole world, and with colonial experience as an important stimulus, it integrated very closely every aspect of its own economy, from agriculture to banking, but distribution was not social in character. The fruits of human labor went to a given minority class, which was of the white race and resident in Europe and North America. This is the crux of the dialectical process of development and underdevelopment as it evolved under the colonial period. So we wrapped up chapter A, or section A of chapter 5, and we'll do B and C next week, and then the week after that we'll do D, and that'll be chapter 5 wrapped up, I believe. Chapter 5 is quite long, so I'm just pacing myself for it since it's so long. Let's see. Yeah, because chapter 5 ends on page 318 of the PDF. So he's talking about a lot there. He's talking about the social character of production. He's talking about let's see. He's talking about the social character of production. He's talking about how there is a material benefit to Europeans for engaging in colonization, in terms of like an influx and a strengthening of like a job market from the European standpoint. But like the socialization of this economic relation necessarily means that as somebody goes to benefit, that being the colonizing Europeans and living in both Europe and North America, that the colonized workers get the short end of the stick and find themselves unable to reap the benefits of the labor that they're being able to do, because they're the ones engaging in the production process. They're the ones turning in the mining process. They're the ones producing the raw resources that the Europeans abstract and turn into produce in the first place, but they're not being fairly compensated for that labor. This is unfortunately the logic of colonialism. But he says distribution was not social in character. He said the fruits of human labor went to a given minority class. the white race and resident in Europe. So production is social, but distribution is not social because it's going to the minority class, and as such, it's the antithesis of social. It's actually an extremely antisocial distribution um, strategy that they have in terms of like concentrating the distribution in the hands of as few colonizing people as they can. So that's something to keep in mind. There's a difference there's a difference between social or distributive socialization and productive socialization. And there is productive socialization going on in this relation, but there is no distributive socialization. So that's something to keep in mind. Um, he said in the earliest phases of human organization, production was scattered and atomized. That's to say, family preserved separate identity while working for their upkeep. Over time, production became more social and interrelated in character. The making of a pair of shoes in a mature feudal trading economy involved a cattle rearer, a tanner of the leather, and a shoemaker. Instead of one peasant killing an animal and making himself a pair of shoes, as under self-sufficient communalism. The extent to which a society achieves this social interdependence in making commodities is an index of its development. So we're actually seeing that the social character of society is being eroded away by capitalism under this explanation, as production becomes actually more centralized and pushed and phased out. And humans are being phased out of production altogether. So it's actually becoming a super antisocial institution. That's something we have to talk about in today's conditions. I actually wonder if anybody wrote about that. I'll have to do some research and let y'all know. Those are some good things to take note of. We're going to continue with chapter B or section B of chapter 5 of the second section next week. And until then, y'all, solidarity. I love y'all, comrades. Y'all take care. And I'll see you guys tomorrow for Women, Race, and Class. Sayonara.